Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 213 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cebulski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. For the better part of a millennium, people have been applying the tenets of chivalry to their personal lives in order to give themselves moral and ethical targets to tilt at. But what does it look like to apply medieval ideals to the 21st century? And what does it mean to walk the walk of knighthood in a high-tech society? This week, I spoke with Jason Kingsley about living a chivalrous life in the modern world. You've probably seen Jason in one of the many videos on his YouTube channel, Modern History TV, where he's dressed in full medieval kit and often on horseback. In addition to being a YouTube sensation, Jason is also the co-founder and CEO of Rebellion Games, the studio behind Sniper Elite, Joust Legend, and Evil Genius. As a reenactor, horse trainer, and former trustee at the Royal Armories, he spent a lifetime seeing the world through the visor of a medieval knight. His new book is Leading the Rebellion, Questing to Succeed in Work and Life, which outlines just how he applies the ideals of chivalry to his own life. Our conversation on video games, quests, and how a knight might behave in the boardroom is coming up right after this. Well, thank you so much, Jason, for joining me to talk about chivalry and especially how it applies to modern life. It is a pleasure to meet you.
It's a pleasure to be here, actually. It's very exciting. I'm looking forward to the wandering conversation we're likely to have as a result of everything medieval.
Yes, I mean, that's the best conversation, I think, when you get two people who are just super into it and they just chat like they're at the pub. I think that's the best kind of content. Right. So your book is about basically how to apply chivalric rules to modern business and modern life. And you outline, although you're very clear about this not being a single code of chivalry, that you're working with something that is basically a code of chivalry. And it's got 12 aspects to it. Where did you dig this up? Where did you collect these ideals from?
Well, you'll be amused to know that when I first started looking into this, I thought it would be relatively easy to sort of find a definitive list of the rules of chivalry. But it's a little bit like walking through mist. It's just out of reach the whole time. So I kind of assembled it from lots of different sort of medieval sources and even some post-medieval sources. And I also had to look up the meaning of some words like sagacity, because the word sagacity isn't something I particularly use in ordinary speech, although I should probably try to use it at least once a week. But it's kind of hard to get into most conversations. Other things like humility and prudence, we use more often. But what started out as a nice idea when I decided to have a go at writing a book turned into a bit of a quest and a challenge of all of its own, which is kind of appropriate, I guess, for the whole knightly chivalric thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember going to a conference and there was a whole panel of eminent historians talking about what is the definition of chivalry. And we didn't get there, listening to them speak. Everyone had a different take on it because it is a very foggy concept. It's got some core things to it, which I think don't change, like faith, for example. And that's where you start the book. But all the other qualities seem to fade in and out depending on who you're talking about and when.
Yeah, who, when, the geography, the particular political circumstances around the use of the chivalric code, and also culturally as well, because I find it fascinating to think that, for example, in Germany, what became Germany now, of course, there wasn't Germany in the medieval period, the Holy Roman Empire, which somebody said was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire at the time, although people have discussions about that. The idea that humility was not a chivalric ideal. So I can imagine knights from other places where humility is part of the chivalric code meeting German knights, and the Germans are having big arguments about how great they are. So they could be boastful, but also chivalric. And it's sort of fascinating whether that maps across into modern nationalistic sort of cliches. I don't think it does, actually, because most of the Germans I know are great. But I found it quite funny. And it is always a struggle. And any historian, any study of history will know that almost the more you look into something, the more exceptions you find, the more, it doesn't quite work that way there. Or actually, you know what, here's a bit of information that kind of undermines that for this particular place geographically and time.
Yeah.
And so I think when we're talking about history in the broadest sense of the term, you kind of have to look at it at a higher level sometimes to get the gist. And sometimes that gist, when you actually drill down into it, is just wrong. Right? I was doing some research for my channel, Modern History TV, and I was trying to summarize the 1,000 years worth of peasant experience in a 10-minute video, which is,
Mhm.
nigh on impossible. But, just understanding that part of England was under Danelaw for a long time, and part of England was not under Danelaw. And it wasn't even England, arguably. There was Northumbria, which was its own thing, and Cornwall, which was its own thing. And
Mhm.
the trouble is, you can trip yourself up horribly by talking about all the exceptions to the rule, and is the rule even relevant? So yeah, it was absolutely fascinating. And I grew up on the edge of the Danelaw, the diagonal line. For those that don't know, the sort of northeast of the island was sort of vaguely Danelaw, and the southwest, again, diagonally, was sort of vaguely not. And along the line, it's very wiggly, and the rules differ. The rules for ordinary people differ dramatically. That must have been a fascinating time to be alive.
Yes. I mean, one of the things you mentioned in the book is that this is a great time to be alive. And I have to agree with you on that one.
Yes,
But of
yes.
course, it is a fascinating time to study the people who are alive at that
Well,
time.
Well, if you could go back in history, one of the questions I'm always asked, and I'll ask you now, is what are the things you would like to sort of see or experience, and not necessarily live in that time, but just have a look for a few hours to see whether it's true or not?
I think as long as I had all my shots, if I was encased in a bubble, I'd want to see something like a marketplace because if I only
Mm.
had the afternoon, then I could see all the different ways people are relating to each other, the stuff that they have, that material culture. I think that would be pretty good. But I've never been asked that particular question before. Always, do you want to go back to history?
Yeah,
At what
yeah.
point do you want? It's like never. I don't actually want to go unless I can be safely invisible, probably, and totally impermeable to any germs.
Yeah, I think it would be such a culture shock for us as well. I mean, just the sheer amount of physical labor that goes on. I've got some building work going on at the moment where I live, and I was just talking to one of the builders, and we were discussing medieval things. And the fact that materials now are relatively cheap, but hours of people's skill is relatively expensive. That's all
Mhm.
swapped around. And back in the medieval period, it was the other way around. So, people were, well, until plagues and things changed that, but basically people's time was relatively cheap, but
Mhm.
materials were expensive. And how does that change our perception of what we see on something? So seeing something that's highly decorated isn't necessarily high status because it was possibly decorated by somebody that was on very low pay or no pay at all.
Yeah.
Whereas seeing something that's sort of golden was, incredibly valuable, or velvet was disproportionately more valuable as far as we're concerned.
Hmm.
I looked into the cost of getting a hand cut velvet doublet made once
Wow.
because I
And
just thought that'd be so cool. I couldn't really find any hand cut velvet made anymore. I actually did find it in Venice. There's a place in Venice that makes this beautiful velvet, which ironically seems to be largely used to line coffins of people in the Catholic Church, which is sort of a bit odd. But I thought, yeah, kind of make a cool doublet. But you need about 4 meters, 4 or 5 meters of this for a doublet, and this was close on to €1,000, £1,000, $1,000 per meter. So, so you're talking just the raw materials today for a posh velvet doublet would set you back 4,000, 5,000. So you're going to go to an expensive tailor to get it made because if the
hmm
material's costing that. So anybody walking around in a velvet doublet back then, you're probably staring at somebody wearing price of a reasonable, not too bad car as jackets.
hmm
Savile Row suits aren't that expensive.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is why you donate them to the church afterwards so they get reused because they cost so much. And we have so many priests who are saying this is the worst kind of waste, which is
Yeah.
another familiar argument, right? So
Yes, yes,
you don't want to drop 4,000 on a doublet, but you have your own custom suits of armor.
yes. Well, this is true.
Victorian.
Yes.
That's a Victorian word you mentioned in the book, so I should probably mention it. We call it harness, but you have custom suits. Tell us about those. Where do you get them?
Well, the word that was used at the time is harness, so hence the expression in modern insurance terms, dying in harness, which means dying while you're still at work, and what your next of kin, what they get as a result of it. People often think that term refers to horse harness, which maybe it does as well, but I thought it was really interesting to think that fighting men back then wore harness like horses did. It's made by craftspeople, by studios that specialize in the medieval armor. The difference these days is that sheet steel is much more consistent in quality than it would have been back then. The difference is that the thicknesses don't vary. So across a breastplate made in the medieval period, it will typically be thicker at the middle and then the front, and then thin as it goes round the outside. That's really hard to emulate these days because you need people who know how to thin steel very, very well. So typically the armor is more consistent thickness, which does probably make it feel different to wear, but I've never worn original harness, of course. My stuff is custom made by a variety of different people. I actually have 5 harnesses in different age, different sort of parts of history, going back to the Norman times, which is basically a long hauberk of what's called chainmail or mail. Some people just call it mail, which are those interlinked rings that are riveted. Now, that in itself as a type of armor goes back into antiquity. So it's been used for thousands of years, chainmail, or let's call it chainmail now because people probably recognize it more easily. And that was interesting. And then you start to add plates on the shoulders and the knees. And of course, because I'm a cavalryman, I need to be able to ride in my armor as well. And that's an important thing because sometimes if the armor is too long on the body, when you ride, it pushes up into your throat.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really uncomfortable too. So armor has got to be made for the purpose which is meant for. So cavalry or foot is often a bit different. And how you fight and how you hold the reins. Obviously, you typically tend to hold the reins in your left hand and hold a lance or a sword or a mace or an axe in your right. So the armor, especially as you get towards the end of the 15th century, middle to end of the 15th century, gets very asymmetrical because you've got to do different things on different sides of the body. And that's sort of interesting. The thing that I find the most difficult to deal with, though, is the helmet. The lack of air in particular, especially on a hot day. The fact you can't scratch your nose very easily. I mean, some have visors, but you know, if you get an itchy nose or I've got long hair, so sometimes you get sweaty in the armor, and sometimes a piece of hair might trick onto your face, and you desperately want to get inside your helmet to try and get the hair off your forehead, and that can be really awkward. And I did get once, not exactly panicky, but close to panic when a frogmouth helmet was put on me.
Mm-hmm.
For those who don't know, frogmouth helmet is effectively a shaped steel bucket that is strapped to your chest and back by staples. So you get on the horse in this is Tudor armor. You get on the horse, and the helmet is sort of pushed down over your head. You put a balaclava of linen on that's on the inside. It's strapped into the helmet, so it suspends your head in the middle of the helmet itself. So if you get hit from the front, your head doesn't smash into the front of the helmet. It's all carefully kind of designed to protect you from that. We didn't know at the time. I guess we should have thought about it, but it's quite close fitting. When it came to take the helmet off after a joust, I'd sweated copiously. And for those that obviously know, linen gets kind of tacky and sticky, and it absorbs the water and it shrinks. And the lining of the helmet had shrunk onto my head. And I couldn't, they trying to pull this helmet off my head. And I said, stop. It's not coming off. My helmet is not coming off. And everybody was, and this is a public show. This is for English heritage at a place called Kenilworth Castle. And I was saying to the two ground crew either side, so I'm still sitting on a horse. They're on boxes either side of me going, well, should we just pull it harder? I went, no, it's stuck on my nose. So what I had to do is, because you can't get into it, I had to sort of put my head and chin down and sort of use my lips and chin to get the chin of the balaclava up over my mouth and kind of up, eventually sort of wiggling it up so that it was over my nose. And once it was over my nose, they could sort of slide the helmet off by wiggling it left and right in, moment by moment, trying to get the thing off. There was a time when I thought they're going to have to get an angle grinder out. And so I hope if they do, A, I'm safe, and B, somebody is filming it because it's going to make great YouTube content.
I mean, it's going to set our ideas of the Middle Ages back a long way because there's already a lot of people who say, you're riding in a tin can. So,
oh well, I think these are all the human experiences. They must have got sweaty when jousting and doing tournament. linen changes. How did they account for that? Well, the people would have been going, get this blooming thing off me. But they were rich men used to getting their own way. They have staff. The staff are panicking like mad. How do we get Sir John out of his armor? It's stuck on. All these things we never hear about because they probably didn't write about them. But all these sort of personal level details of panicking. The other thing is when you wear armor, you're usually measured in your armor. And often if you eat too many pies, let's say, and then you're going into tournament in the spring or something, and your armor doesn't fit,
Yeah.
it's not going to stretch. It's very unforgiving. I helped arm up a colleague. I won't mention his name because it'd be embarrassing for him, but I helped try and put his armor on. I was trying to put the back and breastplate together, and there's a big gap. The two plates weren't fitting together. And I said to him, I think something's stuck because sometimes you can get cloth stuck in the hinge on the other side and it stops it from shutting. So I had a look and there was nothing stuck. I said, I don't know. The armor's not fitting you, my lord. This is out loud. And he whispered to me, he said, yeah, I've put on some weight. Shut up. So I had
But
to
it's
sort of
true.
fasten it with a belt. And there's a big gap on his right hand side, which he wasn't going to get hit by the lances. But there was a big gap on that side, and he went into the lists with that. And I don't think anybody noticed, but we knew that my knight had been eating too many pies for the joust.
Well, I have come across, so I just wrote a book that deals with chivalry and modern life as well, in a totally different way from yours. But there are instances where people say this one guy, he's too fat for his armor. And it's saying that, he was too, well, he was doing too much eating over the winter. And as you say, it's the winter. People eat too much and then they can't fit in their armor. And it is something that knights said to each other as an
Really? Oh,
insult.
so it's historically accurate. Absolutely. How wonderful is that? We exactly the same human condition. Armor is built for you in one particular moment of your life, and as you get older or you get fitter,
Mhm.
maybe knights in a campaign couldn't wear their armor because maybe they put on too much bulk from
Mhm.
fighting.
Mhm.
There's a possibility. And you do get used to wearing it as well. Have you worn armor
I
at all?
haven't. I
Uh,
haven't. No, but I always have wanted to. So maybe next time when I'm in Leeds, I can really beg to put some on.
Yeah, I think it gives you a different view of the human being that must have been inside it. And it's very protective, but it also makes you vulnerable in terms of your hearing and your vision. I don't find it that difficult to move in, but you do get much more well, I get much more tired much more quickly.
Mhm.
And I do wonder whether this is why cavalry was preferred, because at least you're not walking around when you're wearing the armor so much.
That's true. That's true. But I think that some of the things that you're mentioning, like panic, are really important. When you look back at the sources and you see these knights drowned, you can imagine
Oh.
that they're panicking. Maybe they can't get
Mm.
around. Maybe they can't get up. And even though they can move in armor, I think that panic is something that we don't usually talk about when we talk about knights. And I think it's something that's worth bringing up. So
Mm.
that's an experience that you can only have if you put that armor on. Not that I think everyone should put armor on and panic and see what it's like, but I think you get what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, well, some people literally can't wear certain helmets. I have a one colleague when we were in practice was trying to put a frog mouth on for the first time, and he immediately said, "No, take it off.
Hmm.
I know I can't cope with the claustrophobia of wearing a frog mouth helm." And
Hmm.
some people are very okay with it. I've got colleagues who don't seem to be bothered by it, but I think I'm somewhere in the middle. And when I'm wearing a frog mouth, I have to actively control my sense of panic.
Hmm.
I do remember one joust down at Pendennis. It was a miserable Sunday morning joust. Horrible weather it had been. It wasn't a big crowd. And I remember jousting. I remember normally we in those circumstances we do 9 passes. And I remember on the seventh pass thinking, oh good, only a few more passes to go. And I
Hmm.
thought, hang on, that's totally the wrong attitude. This
Yeah.
isn't about just getting through it. This is about the experience. But I do wonder again if that's a thing because tournaments were about social status and social display. And I wonder if sometimes the men involved didn't really want to do it, but kind
Hmm.
of felt socially obliged. Is
Yeah.
there any evidence of that kind of thing that
I
you're
don't,
aware of?
not that I'm aware of, because that's not the type of thing you'd really want to admit to.
Mm.
That I didn't want to be there. I'm tired, not feeling great. No, I haven't come across that in tournaments. But then the other thing is that often the the stuff that's being written about tournaments is being written by heralds, as you know, or chroniclers or things like that. You do have people like Jason. I don't know if you've ever read that book, but it's really good. And it is a pseudo disguised autobiography. So that's a first person perspective from a distance in some ways. But even he's talking more about war instead of tournament, but he doesn't say, oh, I didn't feel like it that day.
I suppose these days we're perhaps more okay with saying we're having a bad day, or okay
Mhm.
with saying we felt that wasn't a good day. Whereas back then, maybe it wasn't knightly to say you had a bad day, or not knightly to say you actually don't particularly enjoy the process of tournament anymore, or something. I don't know. Yeah, attitudes change, don't they?
Yeah.
What you're allowed to say and not say.
Yeah, I think it's the type of thing you'd say to your friends. I think you'd
Mm.
absolutely say that to your friends, but not write it down on
Yeah, yeah,
parchment, because
exactly.
parchment is forever.
Yeah, and I suppose those heralds are being paid to make their boss sound cool and heroic. So
Mm.
even if Sir Jason was not on form this day and had eaten too many pies and was having a really bad time and was grumpy, they will say, for the record that he had a wonderful time and he
Yeah,
fought manfully and triumphed dramatically,
that's right.
because that makes for a better chronicle, doesn't it? And
Yes.
this is a form of media. This is the media, isn't it? This is media spin, I suppose.
Yes, exactly. And this is a good segue for me because one of the things I think most of the people who have come across your work before that are listening to this podcast have come across your YouTube channel, Modern
Uh-huh.
History, but they may not know that you're also a CEO of a massively successful video game company. So this is relevant to the book and to your being here because you're one of the few people that I think can understand both sides of knighthood in that you have a responsibility over many people and you also spend a lot of time shoveling your horse stalls.
Yes.
So how did you find that this work as a CEO is affected by the work that you do when you're jousting? Like how, I mean, walk us through how chivalry affects your work as a CEO.
I'm very big on business ethics, and I think one should live one's life as ethically as you can. I don't mean in the sort of Teutonic knights or Knights Templar kind of ascetic kind of way. I mean more sort of secular knight, in that I think if you can, you should pay people on time. If you negotiate a deal, you should try to negotiate so that both sides gain something positive, because I think a good working relationship with suppliers and customers is likely to be repeated. And therefore, it's actually better for everybody. If you do a good job for somebody, there's a fair chance if they need that job doing again, they'll come back to you and you'll do it again. I dislike the media portrayal of CEOs in general as rapacious kind of robber barons. There are some, without question. And I think I remember reading a book somewhere about CEOs and bankers saying there's a disproportionate number of psychopaths who are drawn to those roles, which is interesting. And I've probably met a few of them as well. And that's slightly unnerving to know that you've met psychopaths. But at the same time, if you do meet people like that, and if you're prepared, you can manage that as well. And so preparation for battle is a part of knighthood. You plan your campaign, you use wisdom. Knights, a lot of them studied the Roman writers, Vitruvius, and he's more for medicine, but some of the more military Roman writers, those were big things for the medieval mind as well. And therefore the sort of strategy and tactics of business. But really, the two areas of my business world and my kind of love of medieval things and horses, I didn't really put two and two together. And somebody I was having a conversation with a friend, and he was talking about chivalry. And I suddenly thought, you know what, that would be a really interesting topic to pursue and to look into. And that's when I suddenly thought, I'll do a bit of research and see whether I do sort of live my life according to a code. And as we said right at the very beginning, the code is almost an aspiration. And I think it's very human to aspire to things, but also fail. And I think it's almost like the journey is the trying, and it's
Yeah.
the journey that is important. And just as the Arthurian mythos, the Arthurian cycle and that very complex set of literature is often about frailty and people failing to reach those ideals. Very, very few people actually achieve their goals. And I think that's one of the central messages of chivalry and the central messages of the Arthurian cycle is the idea that you should still try, even if you
Mm-hmm.
fail.
Mm-hmm.
Trying is the thing. And I think that's the same in business. I say in the book that one of the hardest things to do in business is to go from having an idea to actually putting the idea into effect. I mean, I presume, I don't know how long you've been doing this podcast, but can you remember yourself deciding, actually, you know what, I'm going to have a go at this podcasting stuff,
Yes, yes. And I had to
And
think about it for months before I actually pulled the trigger.
yeah, so that first step, as Tolkien said, if you step outside your door, it can take you to all sorts of interesting places. So be careful. But that first step to decide to do something is possibly one of the hardest things in business, or quite frankly, in any endeavor, including podcasting, including YouTube, because you will always get naysayers. You'll always get people
Yes.
telling you it's really difficult. You'll get people criticizing you. You'll get things wrong. I've got things very wrong. I've done more research and gone, oh no, I completely messed that up. I've got that wrong. And it's embarrassing because it's there for everybody to see. And even if you put a comment saying, yeah, sorry, everybody, I actually got this wrong. Here's the actual correct data. It doesn't matter. You still said it wrongly in the video.
We've
And
all been
and
there.
and I think that's part of the chivalric code, which is you failed, but
Hmm.
keep going on your quest. And somebody said, well, modern people don't really go on quests, do they? I said, well, literally, yes, they do go on quests, but a quest doesn't have to be a giant thing. The quest can be start writing that book you've always wanted to write,
Hmm.
start that podcast, try to get fitter and healthier. These can all be internalized as a bit of a quest. And it's actually quite funny if you do that. If you think to yourself, right, today, everything I do is going to be framed in terms of a quest. My first quest is to make a cup of tea. I mean, it can be quite fun, and it does give you a sense of achievement as well. Say, right, today I've got to write that email I've been putting off. I've got to speak to that person I need to speak to, and I haven't really got round to it. And if you sort of set it as an objective, your holy grail for that day, it actually can be quite fun. It kind of puts it in a different perspective.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because you've made me think of something I've never thought of before. Whereas in modern life, we have goals, right? We are focused on the objective, but the word that's used in Arthurian myth, for example, is quest. It's based on the journey. That's the focus, is the journey,
Absolutely.
not the
Yes.
goal. And so it's the quest for the Holy Grail. It's not, this is, Holy Grail
Yes.
Day.
Well, in some cases, actually reaching a goal can be a bit disappointing. And there's a lot of people I know that really want to start their business. They start the business, it's successful, and now they go, right, well, my next goal, my
Hmm.
next quest, I've achieved this, but they're sort of almost left wanting because the quest, the micro quest, has been successful.
Hmm.
Great. Now they immediately need to set themselves another goal. And
Hmm.
because for a lot of people, the motivation is, as you say, is the journey. And I'm doing quite a lot of research on pilgrimages, medieval pilgrimages, and how they were run and all that kind of stuff. It's a big business, still quite a big business today. People still go on pilgrimages. And most of the people that I've talked to who've done them say it's actually about the journey, literally, as well as metaphorically. And it's
Hmm.
about the things they encounter on the way. And once they get to Santiago de Compostela, it's great. It's sort of the end, but it's almost a little bit disappointing because the journey's been the thing. And if you're totally focused on getting there, well, you can just get a flight there, can't you? And just bang. But that's not the point. The point is to suffer a little bit on the way, but not suffer, sort of take yourself out of your comfort zone. I really want to do a pilgrimage one day myself.
Hmm.
I'd love to do that, but it's just finding the time, of course.
Yes, yes. Well, this is really interesting. And one of the things that you talk about in the book as well, because your company is video games, where you
Yeah.
have to really make a quest that people want to keep doing. Because if you make the quest too easy, people are not going to play your game. So, how does this inform when you're designing games, how to make it work for people
Oh,
who are
well,
playing
yeah.
them?
Well, games design is all about empowering the player, challenging them, but not to the point where they give up and put the game down or throw it away. It's a careful balance. And well, the great thing about a computer game, unlike a book or a movie, is that you can modify the game. You can get feedback from the player. If the player's finding an area difficult, you can modify the difficulty on the fly so that they won't know, but you've made it slightly easier because they're having difficulty with this component of the game. Or you can upload new data that will make it easier for the next player. So data analysis is a big part of modern computer games. But it's very expensive to make a computer game these days. I mean, big computer games cost as much as big movies now. And the computer games industry is bigger than the movie industry and the TV industry combined. It's enormous, but a lot of people don't know about that. You can also make low budget computer games as well. So you can make computer games for a few £1,000s too. But it's about challenging and entertaining in the right kind of balance. And the quest narrative is a very big part of most modern computer games. There's a new game out at the moment called Baldur's Gate 3, which is all about, it's sort of medieval fantasy. It's not historical, but it kind of leans on the medieval tropes in knights and wizards and that kind of dragons. And that is always framed in the narrative of the quest. So there's always a thing you've got to go and get, or a problem you've got to solve, or a person you've got to rescue. And those are basically computer game versions of the Arthurian stories. Nothing much has changed. They're just interactive now, and the graphics are better. So the human condition. I wonder if you sat a reasonably well-read medieval person in front of a screen, they'd probably not quite get it immediately, but I think fairly quickly they'd realize this is a form of modifying parchment. That you don't have to write it out, and typing is an interesting thing. They'd probably get that because it's sort of a quick way of making letters. And I think a reasonably sophisticated medieval person would probably get computers, or they certainly understand the principles of computers within a few hours, to be honest. They'd probably be amazed at the vast depth of knowledge we could get, and then be appalled at the vast triviality with which most people use this amazingly powerful human tool we've created. I mean, it's absurd. You think about it. We've all got immense amounts of research at our fingertips, and a lot of us, even people that are doing research, sometimes faff around on the computer and just looking at social media.
Yeah, well, I mean, we are human beings,
well,
right?
It's true. I know.
We know that a knight's not always going to be focused on the tournament. He's also going to be focused on how he looks at the tournament. And if he had the power of Instagram, he would be using it when he looks that good, right?
Absolutely. Well, the display was a very important part of it, the social display, wasn't there? And it still is. People go to galas, and the whole point is the red carpet beforehand and the photos that get taken and published. Nothing's really changed. Knights would have turned up in their finery to show off in front of everybody and be written about, I'm sure. Somebody said, how would you describe a tournament? And I said, well, you know what? I think it's got a certain amount of wrestling about it, professional wrestling, showmanship. And I think that's probably, I don't think it was likely scripted or fixed, beforehand. I think it's unlikely to have been the case. I think they were genuinely fighting, trying to beat each other. Although, who knows? Again, we wouldn't know that. It wouldn't be written down. But the one-upmanship of really posh silk caparisons on your horse, or ostrich plumes, which everybody knew had taken a lot of money to get brought to this country, or the outfit that your pages were in, as sort of showing off, was as much part of it as the actual runs and the actual lances themselves. And I do wonder whether part of the appeal for ordinary people about the joust was the fact that the posh rich people might hurt themselves as well.
Yeah, to see that lord that you never really liked end up in the dirt must have felt pretty good, I think.
Yes, exactly. Yay! A bit like people go and watch ice hockey for the fights and NASCAR for the crashes and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's something that you have experience of as well. You mentioned in the book too about video games. It's like, how much gore do we put in here? And who is it appealing to? And should we switch it off?
Yes, yeah, you do have to make some interesting ethical decisions when you make a computer game, because these days you can go into immense detail about circumstances and about people's interiors and the geometry of a human body, especially in a game like Sniper Elite, which is about sniping. For those that don't know, one of our biggest brands is called Sniper Elite. It's about the secret war during the Second World War, so the sort of special forces behind enemy lines, and about the battle of the super weapons, the Nazi super weapons against the Allied super weapons and that kind of stuff. And your job generally is to do missions. Those missions might be to get the plans of a super rocket that the Nazis are developing and destroy the super rocket factory, whatever. But in that process, you're going to use a sniper rifle. And one of the challenges when making a game is, how gratuitous does it need to be for the drama? How gratuitous do you want it to be for sales, for the audience you're dealing with? What are you trying to say with the violence? And one of the themes behind Sniper Elite, right from the early days, is that shooting people is really horrible.
Yeah.
And we genuinely wanted to sort of bring out it's actually a really horrible and difficult thing to do. So if you can do the mission without killing people and you choose to do that, then great. I mean, this is often lost on the audience, obviously, because it's spectacularly gory. Sometimes you get slow-mo cameras of bullets entering heads and eyeballs and things. So it's genuinely upsetting sometimes if you play it with a certain mindset. We've done quite a lot of research with real special forces snipers, and the amazing thing is a lot of soldiers play violent video games to decompress after really fighting. I think that's an interesting example of human psychology. It takes them away from themselves. It's also training. Computer games are used as training for soldiers as well. And some of these snipers, one in particular, said, "You know what?" He said, "I've shot quite a few real people." He said, "This has made me think about what I was doing more than any of my training ever did, because I was very physically distanced. And of course, with a modern sniper rifle, you don't really see the details. You can't. With the computer game, we follow the bullet sometimes. You can turn it off as well in the game if you don't want that, but you can follow the bullet sometimes to its end point. And that's kind of sobering, because no matter the rights and wrongs of either side, there's still a human being who doesn't want to die behind that bullet. And that's shocking. And then you come back to the whole medieval battle and you realize how close that was.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, they did have artillery, trebuchets and longbows and crossbows, but longbows and crossbows, realistically, the effective range, well, my longbow doesn't really go more than about 250 yards. So realistically, you're going to be shooting it at 100 yards.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to be hitting somebody over the head with a hammer when you can see them.
Mm-hmm.
You're in hugging distance when you stab somebody. That's just awful.
Mm-hmm.
And I was looking into PTSD as a phenomenon that we obviously know about now, and is absolutely very serious. And it struck me, it absolutely must have existed historically. I mean,
It
we know
did.
it existed in the First World War, but do we have any references to it in medieval or earlier?
Yeah, we do. In
We do.
that there's some expectation that someone might come back from war and not be quite right. So there's some
Okay.
actual legal protection put in place if somebody comes back and they're different. So that
Okay.
was really interesting when I learned about that a few years ago, that people expected you might come back from war and not be the same. And I think that is exactly what you're saying, where when we think about it in a human element, people actually don't really like killing each other.
Yeah,
So to be
absolutely.
put in that spot would be difficult. And I think it did have a psychological impact. And we can see that sort of indirectly, but it's not,
Mm.
again, something that you'd want to write down about yourself, because that might not make you look the most chivalrous, perhaps.
No, but you're going to have to go home after fighting at Bosworth, and the horrors you would have seen, that will almost certainly change everybody that experienced it. They've
Mm-hmm.
got to go home. They've got to plow the fields. They've got to look after the cows. They've got family, friends. Whole societies are going to be damaged by that kind of thing happening. That's pretty sobering. I mean, some people seem to be okay about it. I mean, what's interesting when you look into PTSD, there's a proportion of people that don't seem to experience it. They seem to be okay. They think it's horrible, but they don't have any of the complex difficulties, or don't seem to have any of the complex difficulties. And other people are simply destroyed or changed entirely by it and hate themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I was speaking to one modern soldier about this in some detail, and he said that sometimes you end up hating yourself because you weren't affected by it as much as you thought you might be.
Mm-hmm.
And then you start to second guess yourself and go, so am I a nutter then? Am I if that hasn't affected me the way I was told it might affect me, and I'm kind of okay with it, I can cope with it. That makes me feel guilty now, that because I'm not responding in the way I thought I was supposed to respond. And
Yeah.
it's very, very complex. And it
Yes.
must have been back then.
Yeah, I think so. And I think chivalry is probably constructed in some ways, and I hadn't really thought of it in these terms, in order to help people cope as well. We know that there is stuff about just law. When you're sent in to fight, then you're automatically on the side of the angels because you're doing what you've been asked to do. But I think when you have different principles like faith and honor and generosity and all these things built around war, it probably is a crutch too, I would think, to help you deal with it.
Yes, absolutely. I suppose the principles, you followed those principles that you've been brought up with since you were, knee high to a grasshopper. And that gives you some kind of support,
Hmm.
moral or otherwise, some kind of grounds with which to understand this horrible experience you've just gone through. I was talking a little bit about horses, of course, because horses play a big part in my life. I've got 17 of them and I train them. I've got some rescue horses and big ones, small ones, old ones and young ones, and they're all wonderful. And I have to train some of them to wear armor and carry me in armor. And if you've ever heard anybody walk in armor, it makes a lot of noise. When you ride in armor, it makes a lot of noise. So there's quite a lot of training to do with the horse. And the shininess is one of the things. The shininess and the noise seem to be the biggest difficulties for horses. Shininess, perhaps because the only shininess they've seen up to now is horizontal in puddles in the ground.
Yeah.
It's just water. Suddenly it's vertical now, and that's sort of, wow, what's going on here? The noise they find the hardest, or in my experience, they find the hardest to cope with, is the noise of mail on metal. So it's that sort of shushing, that sort of snaky, sort of shush, shush, shush noise. As you canter along, it kind of makes that sort of regular noise. That's the noise they seem to be most worried about, not the clanking and clanging. And I have a pet theory that one of the reasons a lot of medieval horses were trained with bells on their harness, and we know that bells played an important part in road safety and just in telling people you're coming and you're not a baddie, that horses probably got used to that kind of clangor and clatter, and therefore making the transition to actually having a man in armor on your back is substantially easier if you've grown up surrounded by bells that are clattering around you. And I suddenly thought, yeah, that kind of works actually. That's definitely a positive, I suppose. And then I tried to work out how you would train a war horse to deal with bodies on the ground. Bit of a grim thing to think about, but your
Yeah.
horse is your feet, and your cavalry, you're going to be one of the things that cavalry did is chase down retreating or routing enemy. And often that's the best use of them. They're not necessarily so good in a frontal charge, certainly against foot that's organized with long spears and that is going to stand their ground. You can't close as easily, although you probably can close once, but then your horse is going to be killed. But chasing broken, and then you're going to be coming across dead bodies or dying bodies on the ground. Horses don't like treading on dead bodies, and they can turn their ankles, they can trip. How do you train a horse for that? And I just thought I used a bunch of mannequins scattered on the ground. I'm glad nobody saw me doing that because it might have been quite shocking to anybody from the outside. It's like, why are all these
Well,
dead bodies
your
on the
neighbors,
ground?
your neighbors know you, right?
Yeah, well, this is true. Yeah, yeah, he probably did. It's like he's up to his tricks again. But it suddenly occurred to me the complexity of training a horse for war and the levels, and which is why they cost so much.
Hmm.
But they were really expensive, as were a lot of the knightly accoutrements. And I think one of the challenges for later periods of knighthood was that it was an expensive exercise,
Yes.
and a lot
Yeah.
of people didn't have the money for it.
Hmm. Which is why you marry a tradesperson's daughter, right? Who has actual
Oh, of
money.
course. Yes, yes, yeah.
That's the way to fund it. Well, you've grown up around horses. Horses are your life, or at least a big part of your life.
Yeah.
And they appear and are one of the reasons why I think you picked up and did Modern History TV. So before we go, can you tell everyone about Modern History TV, what they can find there and what it's about?
Sure. So it was started as a bit of an experiment. I used to go to live events for English Heritage, Joust. One of the things that I enjoyed afterwards was talking to the kids and talking to adults about what it's like and my horse and explaining all the things. I really enjoyed that, and I just thought it would be nice to do that a bit more. So I started out by really repeating what I used to say to kids after a joust. Is the armor hot? Yes. Is it heavy? Yes. Does it hurt when you fall off? Yes. All these kind of things. And I suddenly started to do the research and look into it and talk about ordinary people, what they might have eaten, how they might have lived their lives. And it's gone from strength to strength. I'd like to make more videos, but I don't have much time sometimes spare. But because I've got horses on site, because I've got the landscape, I live on a farm in Northamptonshire. A lot of the farm is I leave it quite wild, and which is great for the wildlife and for pollinators and birds and animals and things, but it's also great for filming because it's a natural landscape, so it looks medieval. So if I dress up in my medieval kit, it's plausible that I'm actually back in the medieval day. So I explore 10, 15-minute chunks of medieval history. I just did one on did medieval peasants travel? And talking a little bit about pilgrimages and how they might have done it. I did one recently about the difference between taverns, inns, and ale houses, because a lot of people think they're synonymous, and they kind of are. There's a crossover, but they actually were very different in the medieval period. In summary, ale houses are like pubs. They're just places where you can drink beer. The taverns typically sold wine and were a bit more urban, and inns are places you sort of stay when you're traveling. And sometimes there was a tavern attached to an inn, and that was just interesting for people, and it gives people ideas for their role-playing games, for Dungeons and Dragons and all that kind of stuff. And there's a surprisingly large number of my fans and viewers that are playing role-playing games, but trying to bring in a sense of real history into that world. And I think it actually makes it more fun in some ways to sort of base it on European history a little bit. Yeah, it's there. I've got 760,000 subscribers now, and it's watched throughout the world. And it's really gratifying that people care enough about what I do in that world to turn on and watch me do things. But I have the horses as well. So the horses feature, not always, there's not always a place for them, but I present from horseback sometimes, or talk about how to train a horse to use a lance or using the quintain, and which side of the horse's neck you might want to use a spear, or that kind of stuff. And I can practically show it rather than talking abstractly about it. That's the idea. Show, don't tell.
And it's brilliant. And I love those videos. So people can find them, and they can actually find a video of you trying to read part of your book from horseback if they want.
That was very fun. It was a very windy day. It was on Ghost, who's one of my stallions. He's a Cremello stallion, which means he's got beautiful blue eyes, and he's a beautiful horse. He's about the perfect size for a medieval horse, which are typically a lot smaller than most people think. Modern horses are much bigger than the medieval horses, as far as we can tell. And I thought he'd stand nicely, and I'd carefully read out the first page to promote my book. And it turned into a bit more of an exercise, because he's also trained, he's trick trained. So he's trained to rear, and he's trained to Spanish walk and paw the ground. And he's actually trained to lie down. He didn't lie down in the video, thank goodness, but I've trained him to do all of those. And sometimes when he's panicking a bit, or when he's not sure what I'm trying to do, his tricks will come out. And luckily, most of them didn't, apart from the rear. But because it was windy, and those that know about horses, when it's windy, they get feisty. They get more feisty in the wind. And it was a very windy day, and it was funny. It was very funny trying to do that.
Well, for people who want to be introduced to the channel and the book, there is this video for them. Congratulations on the book and the channel and Rebellion. It's just been such a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's been delightful.
To find out more about Jason's medieval work, you can visit his YouTube channel at youtube.com/modernhistorytv. To find out more about his game company, visit rebellion.com. His new book is Leading the Rebellion, Questing to Succeed in Work and Life. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. Hi, Peter.
Hey.
Before we get to what's on the website, I just want to drop something that someone emailed me about, because I think it's so rare that you get to see medieval music being played live. So somebody emailed me to tell me about Les Rêverdis de Montréal, which is a group that's going to be performing the music of Guillaume de Machaut in Montreal on October 13th and 14th. So for all the people who are interested in 14th century music and a very influential composer of the time, Guillaume de Machaut, you can go to their medieval days, which is going to be held at Westmount Park United Church, October 13th and 14th. You can go check it out if you're in Montreal. And I'll give you the website. We'll put it on the show notes as well, right, Peter?
Sure.
It's REVERDIES Montreal.org. So if you love medieval music, go and check it out.
Ooh, I've been to a couple of performances in Toronto, and again, held in churches. And oh man, it's actually really awesome. There's a lot of different music. You'd be surprised on how the songs can be quite different and unusual, but it's amazing. So yeah, if you are in Montreal, go check it out.
Yeah, something to check out. All right, Peter, what is on the website this week?
Well, first, UNESCO, the United Nations Education and Cultural Organization, has come up with a World Heritage List. So every couple of years, they kind of add to this list. These are historically, culturally, or in some cases, naturally important places around the world. And this year, they have 42 new sites have been added to the list, and 9 of those have really good medieval connections.
Wow. Wow. That's awesome. There's lots of cool UNESCO sites that are medieval. And now there's more.
Yeah. They've added some Viking ring fortresses from Denmark, one of those kind of sacred cities in Cambodia. If you're familiar with that, it's just absolutely stunningly beautiful. And also places along the Silk Road in Central Asia. Places like that date from like the 13th or 14th century, just all over the place.
I love it. And it's better to have something have UNESCO status because then it becomes more protected and people are more interested in keeping it safe. And that's what we want.
Exactly. It is a good way of helping protection and letting people know about it, increasing tourism, another way to learn about the medieval past.
Yeah, perfect. That's awesome. So we'll be able to look at the new list on the website.
Indeed, it's already up there. And another post that we already have up is a list of 30 superstitions, or basically beliefs held by peoples that lived in Germany in the 8th century. And this is at a time when they're just converting to Christianity. So these are pagan beliefs. And it was really kind of fascinating. So there's this list that was put together. We're not sure by who. It wound up in the Vatican archives. And it's frustrating because it's only like the headers of the list, right? So it's only like a one sentence about what they did that was, so bad for church, but it was really fascinating and I wanted to put it up.
That's awesome. So it's like a table of contents, but you don't have the rest of the book. Is that what it's like?
Yeah, exactly. So some are really short, but there's really some really fun ones that I wish I would learn more. Like apparently if there was an eclipse, people would cry out, "Triumph Moon."
Ooh, I love that. I'm going to go out and shout that out in the middle of my neighborhood next time there's an eclipse and see what happens.
Apparently women could command the moon to take away the hearts of men.
Shh, don't tell everyone our secrets.
Yeah. And there's a few things that seem to have lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years into the 19th century, like a practice of rubbing sticks together to make fire. Yeah, which I thought was like a Boy Scout kind of thing to do, but apparently it's a pagan ritual dating back hundreds, if not thousands of years.
Amazing. Well, that sounds like a great list. We're going to all have to check that one out for sure.
Indeed. So we've got all that plus much, much more.
Excellent. And there's something new that's happening on Patreon this week, right?
Yes. Thanks for reminding me. Yeah. We have a really good relationship with Patreon. I think they're a really good service and they've really helped us build a community. And they've just offered this new feature where you can sell any kind of digital product, which could be a video or audio or a ebook. And we are going to do ebooks through this Patreon. We're offering to the people that are on it, but even if you're not subscribing to medievalist.net on Patreon, you can still go in and purchase it. And we've got our first book up.
Yes. And the first book is The 5-Minute Medievalist. Wow, we really said that well. Yeah, the first book is The 5-Minute Medievalist, which is my first book, which came out in 2016. And it's still a book that I love. It's just little and cute and all sorts of stuff about the Middle Ages. My first endeavor. And now you can get it, digitally download it from Patreon.
Yes, I can't think of any better way to begin this than with that book. It has a lot of connections with medievalist.net. And I'm very proud that you did it. And, I'm very proud that we get to offer it to our fans.
Yes. So if you download this book you could download it from my website, but if you download it from Patreon, you will be supporting medievalist.net and me. So, this is win-win.
Yes. So look for that. And in the coming weeks, we'll be adding more from yourself, plus from other publishers as well. So keep on an eye for that. And I think that's going to be a really great way to support medievalist.net.
Yeah. Awesome. So if you're not on Patreon, get on Patreon. If you are on Patreon, thank you so much, everyone, for supporting my podcast and also all of Peter's work at medievalist.net and all of the writers and podcasters that he supports too. So thanks, everybody, for being on Patreon. Appreciate it. And thank you, Peter, for stopping by and telling us what's going on the website.
Thanks.
As Peter and I mentioned, it's all happening on Patreon these days, so don't miss out on the opportunity to support medievalists and get yourself some good loot. Check it all out at patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from rebellion to hellions, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or Twitter at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulski, on social media at 5MIN or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can pre-order my new book, Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, which comes out in October. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself an awesome day.